to assess how they would impact upcoming capital projects, specifically the planned staff security facility on the new jail site. Mr. Florin and I have worked with staff from the County Council's Office and Public Works to develop the report before you today. And in addition to our own research, we worked with local trades unions, the Associated Builders and Contractors Northern California Group, professional project labor managers, and agency staff from other counties who have implemented project labor agreements. The agenda item outlines our findings. I'm just going to hit a few highlights and then we'll take questions. The board, again, asked us to focus on the staff secure reentry facility, which is our upcoming large capital project. We consulted with the county's architect on the project, Napa Lewis, as well as 2 independent cost estimators to determine how the introduction of a project labor agreement may impact both the budget and the schedule for the project. And first, I just wanted to take a second to clarify a mistake that I made in the previous presentation on this topic in October. I had at that time stated that a project labor agreement would need to be negotiated prior to March of 2016, which is when we'll start the pre-qualification of contractors for that project. After consultation with Public Works staff, we determined that in actuality a project labor agreement would not necessarily need to be negotiated until November of 2016, which is when the actual bidding would start for the project. And that is actually consistent with other examples that we found. So I just wanted to make sure you all understood that timeline. After clarifying the schedule, our project team talked with both the architects and the cost estimators about the PLA impacts. The consultants determined that the project would likely see a 5 to 6% increase in the estimated costs. Both cost estimators contributed. That increased mostly to the likely reduced number of bidders on the project. Though project labor agreements cannot prohibit a non-union contractor from bidding on a project, many of those contractors choose not to bid on the project for many reasons. Research that we found showed reasons included adherence to core worker requirements, and a lot of this is outlined in your agenda item. Core worker requirements, the payment of union membership dues and benefits in addition to their employees' existing packages. And what we looked at, what we talked about with the cost estimators is really whatever the reasons were, that change in the bidding environment, that reduced number of bidders on a project would increase the cost of the project in all likelihood. With the result being that the upcoming project would cost an estimated $915,000 in addition to the current budgeted amount. And that would need to be funded with county dollars. As you know, that project is largely funded by the state's SB 1022 grant. But per the terms of that grant, any overages over the budgeted amount that we are approved for would be required for the county to provide funding for. So you also asked us to report back on possible terms of a PLA that would require some specific direction, policy direction from your Board of Supervisors, and ththose have been outlined in your board item. I'm just going to highlight the local hiring because we know that that was of utmost importance to your board. We did look at a number of PLAs, both those provided to us by the trade groups as well as other examples we found from throughout the state. And really what we found was that no PLA we researched included anything more than a best effort clause for local hiring. And sort of when we delved into that topic a little bit more, what we found was a lot of agencies have policies or even ordinances surrounding specific targets on local hiring, but a PLA really spoke to the local hiring at that best effort language, which we were concerned with or wanted to understand more. When we spoke with union representatives about this, what we clarified was that that best effort language allows them to also adhere to their separate master labor agreements. So each trade group operates under a master labor agreement that really controls how their signatory contractors and the work that they do happens, and that includes the call for work process. So how they actually dispatch workers to the jobs. And so since each one of those contractors or those unions work under their own MLA, the project labor agreement at a best effort language allows them to still adhere to their own restrictions. So in other words, some unions might not be able to sign on to a PLA that required that you dispatch local residents before non-local residents because that might that might contradict the terms of their master labor agreement. So when we understood that a little bit better, we started looking more into, well, if local hiring here is really the goal, what would be the mechanism to get there? And I think what we've outlined in your board item is one of the things that we feel that we're missing to be able to effectively do that is really a baseline understanding of what our local labor market looks like. And that was consistent with conversations we had with County of Sonoma, San Francisco, some of our project labor management consultants, that to be able to establish both a defensible, and that's an issue, if the ordinance needs to be defensible, we need to be able to understand what it is that the labor market looks like in Napa. So even though your board established a local vendor preference in 2010, and we do report to you on both the number and monetary quantity of competitively bid projects, we don't track labor. We don't track the actual workers on the project. That's at a vendor level. So I think one of the things that we're looking for is a way to understand that labor market, to be able to set those realistic goals. And I think Mr. Florin's going to talk about next steps.
Thank you. So, if the board decides that you would like us to proceed with researching a local hiring ordinance, what we would envision happening is, as Liz mentioned, first starting with this assessment of the local labor market. We probably have to bring in some support to do that. It's a pretty complex subject. And specifically, we want to understand to what extent we establish certain goals, that those goals can realistically be met by the local labor market. So for instance, if we have 20% local hiring on public works jobs, that might include, how many iron workers are there, how many craftsmen are there, how many carpenters are there, et cetera, so that those numbers they're not being set outside the realm of what's possible to enforce. There's also other aspects to an ordinance that would be established, like Liz mentioned. We currently don't track the number of workers that are working on a job. We'd have to establish a system for how we would in fact get those reports and monitor those reports, and of course, in some form, how we would enforce activities that are not in compliance with that ordinance. All of these are pretty complex discussions that we want to make sure, as Liz mentioned, that we have collected prior to presenting something to you, so that when we do present an ordinance, it is legally defensible, that there's a basis upon which we would have established that. I think our suggestion is, based on our recommendation today, is, if you're so inclined to move down that course, is to first proceed and move through that process, and then have us come back to you maybe midway through the process with a report on what we're finding, and then possibly at the end, if it's so determined that this is the course you want to continue on, with an actual ordinance, and at that time then discuss whether or not you think that it would be appropriate to continue with a project labor agreement. We believe we can do that in sufficient time. Although it'll be tight, to be quite candid with you, we believe if we, using best effort, could do that prior to the dates that Liz mentioned, for having to have something in place for a November actual contract RFP. I don't know if the RFP that would go out actually for the staff secure facility.
So we'll take any questions. I'm sure you might have some public comment as well.
Are there any questions for staff? Supervisor Wagon,
I'm trying to understand, you say we decide that we would like, obviously we would like, if I were liking local hire, I would like all of our people to be locally sourced, but say we said, 20% was the number, and so the local groups put out the bid for, and they hired as many as they could locally, and that came out to be 8%. Wouldn't they be at that point? They say we've checked through the area, we've combed the area for this type of position. We only got 8%, so at that point they would be absolved, wouldn't they?
Well, that's a good question. Different jurisdictions have different ways of dealing with that. Some just make the ordinances best faith effort types of sense, and you have to show that you make best faith efforts. Others actually have penalties in them, although from our discussions, we've determined that we don't know of any that have actually enforced those penalties that they have, but some do have penalties that are in there. We actually, the reason we wanted to do a study is because we want to determine what are in fact realistic goals, so that we don't send people off on a wild goose hunt out there.
To say 100%, and
Yeah.
clearly there was never going to be a possibility of 100%.
And what actually our brother county, sister county, whatever, down south in San Francisco, they did set a goal of 40%, for instance, local art, and every contractor there has said they have an incredibly difficult time meeting those goals, and that's the feedback we're getting. We don't want to set this up so that we set established goal numbers that are not realistic. We have an expectation that they could be met, and that's one of the reasons why we need to evaluate that first.
And I would just also add, if I could, that the county of Sonoma defined local maybe differently than what you all are thinking as far as a regional group. And so I think that a part of this conversation would also be, what does local mean to us? Are there tiers? For instance, hire so many from Napa and then go out to our surrounding counties. So I think a part of the discussion needs to be, what is our local force and what is local mean to you all for a policy direction, but in realistic terms, how does that translate to a project?
All right, Supervisor Luce.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment, been part of these discussions and had a lot of folks from all kinds of different perspectives speaking to me on this issue, and we've been feeding those issues and concerns to our staff so they can address this. And so I think what at least I've found, and obviously we're going to hear some more today, is that because of these international agreements, unless we have an ordinance in place, they're stuck just following their rules, which maybe hire somebody from San Francisco because he's the highest seniority. So we need an ordinance in place so that at least many of these labor agreements can recognize that ordinance, and then they have the ability to go and pick Napa first. And so I also think the relationship with the union hall is the best control in terms of making sure those numbers are met. We talk about enforcement. It's an established process for looking out at the entire labor pool throughout the region and county and neighboring counties to ensure that in fact we've got local hire. And so I think that's really important for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is many of my friends who are commuting to San Francisco and beyond to go to work when they really deserve the opportunity to work locally.
All right, anybody else? All right, we'll take public comment now on this issue. Again, this is regarding a project labor agreement for the staff secure re-entry facility.
Just come up.
If you have a comment, please come to the podium, and you have 3 minutes. Please state your name.
Good afternoon, supervisors, and good morning still. Richard Markison. I'm from Sacramento.